Older, Further, Stranger, Episode 7, Toolkits of Freedom. Introduction, The Reapin Painting. There is a painting in St. Petersburg that is almost 3 meters wide. Dozens of men are pressed together in it, laughing, one with his head thrown completely back, another hunched over a table with a quill, a man with an enormous mustache, a man in a turban, someone shirtless, a pipe, a drum. The colors are rich enough that you can almost hear it. Ilya Repin spent over a decade on it. He called it Reply of the Zaporozhian Cossacks. In 1676, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed IV, Sultan of Sultans, Khan of Khans, ruler of the Black Sea and the White Sea, and everything that breathes between them, sent a message to the Cossacks of the Ukrainian steppe demanding their submission. The Cossacks wrote back. Their reply was elaborate, anatomically creative, and very funny. It ended with the date but no year, because they said they had no calendar and were beyond such things. Who were these people? What kind of society produces men who laugh like that when a world empire demands they kneel? That question runs through this essay, not just for the Cossacks, but for a series of groups across 9,000 years of human history who looked at the organizing systems around them, the empires, the dynasties, the plantation economies, the sea bands and enclosures and caste hierarchies, and assembled from whatever was available a completely different way of living, a different subsistence system, a different relationship to territory, a different structure of governance, something that worked on different terms and let them stay free, or at least freer, for as long as they could make it last. What they built is what this essay is about. Not freedom as an abstraction, but freedom as a set of practical tools, specific animals, specific landscapes, specific bodies of knowledge, specific social structures assembled together into a working alternative. The horse plus the steppe plus the elected assembly plus the raiding protocol, the machete plus the mountain forest plus the African botanical knowledge plus the military formation. These are integrated systems, subsistence, governance, mobility, and knowledge woven together. And we call them, for the purposes of this inquiry, toolkits of freedom. One more thing before we begin. These groups were not composed entirely of good people, and the toolkits of freedom were not morally uncomplicated systems. The raids were real. The violence fell on real people. And sometimes these alternative societies ended up mirroring the methods of the powers trying to destroy them. The Cossacks, who started as runaway serfs, building a democratic steppe, republic ended as the Tsar's most effective instrument of repression. The mirror you hold up to the thing trying to destroy you can, held long enough, become the face. These are not morality plays, they are histories. The Cossacks, steppe, river, and the archaeology of departure. To understand the Cossacks, start with what they were running from. Across Poland, Lithuania, and early Muscovite Russia in the 14th and 15th centuries, serfdom was tightening, not gradually, not organically, but through deliberate legal mechanisms engineered by a land-owning class that needed bodies to work its expanding estates. The right of peasants to leave a landlord's land was curtailed, then eliminated, then criminalized. In Muscovy, the Sobornoye Ulozhenie of 1649 would eventually bind peasants and their descendants to the soil in hereditary perpetuity, but the process was well underway long before that document was drafted. By the 15th century, the defining feature of rural life across this enormous region was immobility. The distinction between serfdom and slavery was philosophical rather than practical for the people living inside it. South of the agricultural zone, the steppe began. The steppe, the enormous belt of open grassland running from the Carpathians east through Ukraine and into Central Asia, was ungovernable by any methods available to early modern states. It had no natural choke points a garrison could hold, no roads, no fixed settlements that could anchor an administrative apparatus. It was also genuinely dangerous. The Crimean Tatars had conducted systematic slave raiding expeditions into the settled lands to the north and west for generations, taking hundreds of thousands of captives across the 15th and 16th centuries. The steppe was a frontier in the fullest sense. neither incorporated into any political system nor hospitable to the unprepared. The word Cossack comes from a Turkic root, Kazakh, meaning free man or wanderer or adventurer. It appears in historical sources in the mid 15th century, referring not to a defined ethnic group but to a condition, people who had left the settled agricultural world and were operating outside it. Runaway serfs, men escaping debt bondage, criminals, religious dissidents, younger sons with no inheritance, men who had killed someone and needed to disappear. Slavic peasants predominated, but Tatars, Lithuanians, and others appear in the early records. The Cossack identity was not ethnic, it was occupational and situational, a description of a choice rather than a birth. The first crucial encounter was with the people who already knew the steppe, the Tatars and other Turkic groups who had operated there for centuries. Horseback culture in its full complexity, the breeding and training and fighting and navigating on horseback across open terrain, was not something Slavic peasant refugees had. They acquired it through proximity, necessity, and direct learning from the steppe nomadic world. The archaeology of early Cossack sites shows this in the material record. Tatar horse tack alongside Polish ceramics, alongside Orthodox religious objects, all in the same context. The Cossack toolkit was assembled from multiple sources, not inherited from any single tradition. The rivers of the Ukrainian steppe shaped everything they built. The Dnieper, the Don, the Donets were corridors of movement, sources of protein through fishing, and the architecture of a defense in terrain without walls. Islands, bends, marshes, and rapids provided positions a mobile force could hold against larger conventional armies. The Zaporozhian Sich, the main Cossack stronghold, sat on an island in the Dnieper below the Great Cataracts, the series of rocky rapids that made navigation south difficult. Zaporozhian means beyond the rapids. The rapids were not an obstacle, they were a defensive perimeter. A sich, from a Slavic root meaning a cut or enclosure, was a fortified camp. Wooden palisades, earthwork ramparts, barracks, a church, workshops, storage. The Sikh moved at least 8 times between the late 15th and early 18th centuries. Archaeological investigation of the successive locations is complicated by the fact that several sites are partially submerged beneath reservoirs created by Soviet dam construction on the Dnieper in the 1950s and 1960s. What excavations have recovered is consistent across sites. No monumental architecture, no palace or administrative complex, functional and defensible structures, workshops, storage. The absence of hierarchy in the built environment is itself data. It corroborates the political structure the historical sources describe. The social structure the Cossacks built was specifically designed to not reproduce what they had fled. The Rada, the assembly, was the governing body, meeting when major decisions were required, whether to go to war, whether to negotiate, who would serve as hetman. Every registered Cossack had a voice in it. The hetman, the military leader, was elected and could be removed. No hereditary nobility, no fixed class structure, no right of any man to own another's labor by birth. The Sich organized itself around the explicit rejection of the world that had made departure necessary. The Cossack Chronicles, the Letopis Samovitsia, the Hrabyanka Chronicle, the Velichko Chronicle, document the political debates and the election of hetmans in considerable detail. The archaeology corroborates the picture indirectly. The uniformity of the material record at Sich sites, without accumulations of wealth in any single location, is consistent with the non-aristocratic social order the documents describe. The full toolkit was horse plus river geography plus elected assembly plus rating protocol plus Orthodox Christian identity used as a political and cultural boundary marker. Each element was functional. The horse gave mobility and military capacity. The river system gave food, transport, and defense. The assembly was governance without a state apparatus. The rating, extensive, reaching into Ottoman and Tatar territory, was both economic and diplomatic, a demonstration of capability that gave the Cossacks leverage with the surrounding powers who could not simply ignore them. The Orthodox identity distinguished them from the Catholic Poles and the Muslim Tatars and Ottomans, and they used that distinction consciously in their political maneuvering. The Russian state eventually solved the Cossack problem not militarily, but economically. It became cheaper to pay the Cossacks to guard frontiers than to fight them. Over the course of the 17th and early 18th centuries, successive Cossack hetmanates were progressively integrated into the imperial system, their autonomy narrowed by treaty and administrative pressure. Catherine the Great destroyed the Zaporozhian Sich in 1775 after the Cossacks supported the Pugachev Rebellion. A Russian military force dismantled the fortifications and dispersed the population. Over the course of 2 centuries, the runaway serfs who had built a democratic steppe society became the paramilitary cavalry of the empire they had originally refused. The Repin painting shows the moment before any of that happened. The laughter is the sound of men who still believe they can tell the Sultan of Sultans where to go. They were right for a while. That's not nothing. The Maroons' forest encounter and the making of an African Creole civilization. The Maroons begin with the worst possible starting conditions. Atlantic slavery was a system of total coercive control enforced by violence and backed by the full legal and military apparatus of European colonial states. Enslaved Africans transported to the Caribbean, Brazil, and coastal South America were stripped systematically of language community, family structure, religious practice, and any form of social organization that could support collective resistance. On the sugar estates of Jamaica or Suriname, life expectancy after arrival was measured in years. The system was designed to make sustained resistance impossible. People escaped anyway. Consistently, throughout the history of Atlantic slavery, individuals and small groups got away from the plantations and into the interior. The Spanish word cimarron, meaning wild or feral, applied first to escaped livestock and then to escaped humans, gives us the word maroon. The people it described built it into something else entirely. The geography of the Caribbean and coastal South America made escape viable in ways specific to those landscapes. Jamaica has a mountainous interior, the Blue Mountains in the east, the Cockpit Country in the north center, steep ridges, deep gullies, dense subtropical forest that is nearly impossible to move through without knowing it. Suriname has the interior rainforest. Brazil has the plateau country of what is now Alagoas. These were not landscapes that plantation militia could easily penetrate or hold. A person who reached them had a chance. The first encounter that made Maroon society possible was with the people already there. The Caribbean before European colonization had been occupied by Taino and Arawak peoples across the Greater Antilles and by Kalinago peoples in the Lesser Antilles. These populations were catastrophically reduced by epidemic disease and colonial violence within decades of contact, but they were not gone, especially in the interior. In Jamaica, in Suriname, in coastal Brazil, surviving indigenous communities persisted in the forests and mountains. They possessed exactly what the escaped Africans most urgently needed: knowledge of how to live in this specific terrain, which plants were edible, which routes were passable, where the water sources were, how to build shelter in this climate, how to cultivate in tropical highland soils that looked like farmland but behaved like nothing in West Africa. The Maroons survived their first years in the forest largely because they found people who already knew it and learned from them. This founding encounter shaped everything that followed. The Maroon communities that stabilized in the mountains and forests of Jamaica, Suriname, and Brazil were not reconstructed African societies. They could not be. The people who came together in them were from multiple African cultures, speaking different languages, carrying different traditions of governance, religion, agriculture, and warfare. What they built was new: an African Creole formation, drawing on African cultural resources where those applied, on indigenous Caribbean knowledge where that was relevant, on European elements obtained through trade or brought by the occasional escaped indentured servant who joined them. The synthesis was the society. It was not a compromise or a dilution. It was a genuinely original creation made under the worst possible pressure by people who had no other option. The agricultural system that emerged from this synthesis is visible in the archaeobotanical record at Palmares, the Great Quilombo in what is now the Brazilian state of Alagoas, a confederation of communities that may have held 20 to 30,000 people at its peak and survived for nearly a century before its final destruction in 1694. Pedro Paulo Funari and his colleagues excavated the main Palmares settlement, Angola Jenga, in the 1990s, working deliberately against the colonial sources that had described Palmares as a desperate refugee encampment. The archaeobotanical record, seeds, plant remains, phytoliths preserved in the soil, shows African crop species alongside American crops, cowpea and African rice alongside manioc and maize and varieties of squash that were staples of indigenous Amazonian horticulture. African cultivation knowledge applied to American crops, indigenous American crops integrated into African derived cultivation frameworks, the whole system adapted to highland tropical soils that neither tradition had originally been developed for. The material culture more broadly confirms the synthesis model. European style wheel thrown ceramics obtained through trade appear alongside handmade pottery in African stylistic traditions, used together in the same context. The spatial organization of Angola Janga shows deliberate settlement planning, structures arranged for both habitation and defense, not the random accumulation of a refugee camp. Evidence of metallurgy indicates continued practice of an African craft tradition that happened also to be militarily and economically essential in the new context. Funari's excavations found not poverty, but ingenuity materialized. In Jamaica, the encounter with surviving Taino and Arawak communities gave the Maroons access to the landscape knowledge of the interior mountains. On that foundation, over generations, they built a military toolkit specific to their terrain, guerrilla formations adapted for steep forested country, a communication system using the abeng, a horn made from a cow horn that carried signals across mountain distances, a cellular organizational structure in which small, independent bands could scatter and regroup without a central command vulnerable to capture or destruction. They studied how European forces fought, in formation along paths dependent on supply lines, and developed precise counters, the leeward Maroons under Cudjoe and the windward Maroons under Nanny, whose face now appears on the Jamaican $500 note, conducted a guerrilla campaign against the British military for decades and won, which is the correct word. The Treaty of 1739 is the documentary proof of what this synthesis produced. The British Crown, not a colonial official, not a planter, but the Crown, signed a formal peace agreement with Captain Cudjoe, granting the Leeward Maroons 1,500 acres in perpetuity, full freedom, and the right to self-governance. A European colonial power acknowledging, in writing and in law, that it could not defeat the people it had enslaved. The Maroon communities also built, through this encounter and synthesis process, one of the most substantial bodies of botanical and medicinal knowledge in the Americas, not as a distinct project, but as an expression of the same generative logic. African herbal traditions, indigenous Caribbean plant knowledge, independent discovery in a new environment. The synthesis was maintained orally in the Creole languages the Maroon communities developed and transmitted across generations under conditions of active persecution. It is one expression among many of what the encounter produced. In Suriname, the Saramacca and Ndiuka Maroons signed treaties with the Dutch in the 1760s. Richard Price's decades of fieldwork and collaboration with Saramacca communities has produced a detailed account of a civilization tracing its origins directly to the escaped enslaved of the 17th century. Oral histories, artistic traditions, textile arts, religious practices, a continuous civilizational record from the moment of escape to the present day. That continuity, 3 centuries long and still ongoing, is itself the argument. The African pastoral complex, cattle, climate catastrophe, and 8,000 years of mobile sovereignty. This case is the oldest in the essay, and it starts with a lake in what is now the middle of one of the driest places on Earth. Gobero is a site in the Tenere Desert of Niger, deep Sahara, among the most arid environments anywhere on the planet. In 2000, paleontologist Paul Sereno stumbled across it during an expedition. His team found a cemetery, hundreds of burials in two main occupation phases, spanning from roughly 9,700 to 4,500 years before the present. The bodies are buried carefully. A woman and two children interred in an embrace, arms around each other. A man buried with a hippopotamus. Adults and children with jewelry made from hippopotamus tusk and shell. There are no hippos in the Tenere Desert today. There is almost no rain. Gobero was a lakeshore. The lake was surrounded by grassland. The grassland supported hippos and crocodiles and fish and the cattle that the people at Gobero were herding. The burials date to the African humid period, the Green Sahara, a climatic phase running roughly from 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, during which orbital forcing shifted the monsoon belt north and the Sahara received significantly more rainfall than it does today. Lakes formed, rivers ran, vegetation spread across what is now absolute desert. Human populations moved with it. African cattle domestication happened in this world. The genetic and zooarchaeological consensus places the domestication of African cattle, specifically the humpless longhorn ancestral to modern Sanga breeds, in the eastern Sahara and Nile corridor region around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. This is an independent domestication event from Near Eastern cattle, genetically distinct from a separate wild aurochs population, domesticated in a different place by a different human population. The evidence is twofold. Ancient DNA analysis distinguishes the genetic lineages of ancient cattle remains, and zooarchaeological bone measurement detects the reduction in average size that is the standard signature of domestication as selective breeding begins to take hold. The rock art record at Tassili Nadjer in southern Algeria, one of the densest concentrations of rock art in the world, thousands of images painted and engraved on sandstone across perhaps 12,000 years, tells the same story visually. The oldest images show wildlife: elephants, giraffes, hippos, crocodiles, fauna that require permanent water and are entirely absent from the region today. Then, overlapping with these, appear cattle. Domestic cattle shown with people in managed groups, sometimes with ropes. The images date to the Green Sahara period, and they were made by people who knew these animals intimately. They are the earliest visual record of the pastoral complex that would organize life across much of Africa for the next 8,000 years. Around 5,500 to 4,000 years ago, the rains failed. The African humid period ended as orbital patterns shifted and the monsoon belt retreated south. Lakes dried. Rivers became seasonal, then intermittent, then absent. The fauna that required permanent water died or moved. The human populations that had built their lives around those lakes and rivers moved with them, south and east, down the Nile corridor, into the Sahel, eventually into East Africa, and they took their cattle. A cow stores wealth in a form that is portable, self-reproducing, and nearly impossible for a distant state to seize from a mobile population. Cattle are alliance infrastructure. Give animals at a marriage, pay cattle to settle a blood debt, build and maintain relationships across vast distances through the movement of animals between families and communities. They are a food system: milk, blood in some traditions, eventually meat that follows the rain rather than being fixed to a location. In a landscape where rainfall is unpredictable and drought is a recurring reality, a herd that can be walked to where the grass is provides a hedge against starvation that fixed field agriculture cannot match. And cattle are legible social currency. The size and quality of a herd indicates status, generosity, and the network of relationships that translate into collective security. The pastoral toolkit, cattle plus mobility, plus the kinship and exchange networks that gave mobility social coherence, spread across East Africa over several thousand years, carried by the ancestors of the Nilotic-speaking peoples. the pastoral Neolithic of East Africa, running roughly from 5,000 to 1,200 years before the present, appears in the archaeological record as stone bowl sites, burial cairns, and a distinctive ceramic tradition spread across thousands of kilometers with remarkably consistent material culture. That consistency is the material signature of a mobile toolkit sharing network operating across the continent's eastern flank. The Maasai are the most recognizable expression of this pastoral complex in the popular imagination, and also a relatively recent crystallization of something much older. Ancient DNA work, particularly from the research group around Mary Prendergast, has clarified the population history considerably. The people who identify as Maasai today are genetically a confluence. Nilotic pastoralist ancestry combined with earlier East African forager populations and Cushitic admixture from the Horn of Africa. The distinctive Maasai cultural complex, the age grade system, the cattle centered ceremonial life, the specific material culture, probably consolidated as a distinct identity between 4 and 600 years ago. The toolkit it runs on is several thousand years older. The Moran, the warrior age grade, young men who spend years as mobile herders and fighters before transitioning to elder status, are often described primarily as a military institution. They are a pastoral management system first. Young men in the Moran phase move with the cattle, scout grazing territory, and conduct and defend against raids. The violence and the herding are not separate functions managed by separate institutions. They address the same threats and are organized together for the same practical reason. Maasai identity was also permeable. You became Maasai by adopting the pastoral toolkit, learning the language, entering the age grade system, acquiring cattle, participating in the ceremonial life. Groups were absorbed through alliance, intermarriage, and adoption of practice. This permeability is characteristic of pastoral identities generally, because mobile herding economies function better with more people in them, and because mobility creates the social porousness that fixed settlements foreclose. The Dinka and Nuer of what is now South Sudan offer a useful contrast. Both are Nilotic, both cattle dependent, operating in the same landscape, the Nile floodplain and its associated marshes. Their relationship is not absorption, but ancient rivalry and territorial competition. Same toolkit, different ecological pressure, different outcome. The pastoral logic does not guarantee peaceful coexistence. It creates conditions within which both cooperation and conflict are possible, and which emerges depends on the specifics of geography, scarcity, and history. The colonial disruption of the East African pastoral toolkit was swift and consequential. The Maasai were dispossessed of their highland grazing lands in a series of British administrative decisions between 1904 and 1913, confined to reserves that were smaller and less productive than what they had managed for generations. The mobility that was the system's core defense mechanism was restricted by boundaries, fences, and land tenure systems that treated mobile pastoralism as a lower use than settled agriculture or European ranching. The jumping dance in the tourism brochure is real. It is also the aesthetic remnant of something that was primary, not decorative. The injury has a date. The sea nomads, water as territory, genome as artifact, the Moken, the Bahau, and the Orang Laut, sea nomads scattered across the maritime world from the Andaman Sea to the Sulu archipelago to the Straits of Malacca, chose water the way others chose highlands or desert as a zone that states and empires could not easily enter, administer, or tax. You can put a fort on a mountain pass. The open sea cannot be fortified. The Bajau are the most thoroughly studied, partly because of a remarkable piece of recent biology. The Bajau Laut, the boat-dwelling Bajau, as distinct from those who live along coastlines, are traditional breath-hold divers whose subsistence economy has rested historically on free diving for sea cucumber, pearl oyster, fish, and shellfish at depths of up to 40 meters on a single breath. In 2018, a team led by Melissa Ilardo published a study in Cell comparing the physiology and genetics of Bajo divers to their non-diving neighbors, the Salawan people of Sulawesi. The finding was unambiguous. Bajo divers have spleens averaging approximately 50% larger than those of the Salawan. The spleen is an oxygen reservoir. During breath-hold diving, the mammalian dive reflex causes the spleen to contract, releasing oxygenated red blood cells into the bloodstream and temporarily increasing oxygen capacity. Larger spleen means more reserve oxygen. More reserve oxygen means longer and deeper dives. Ilardo's team then sequenced the genomes of both populations and found strong signatures of positive selection near PDE10A, linked to thyroid hormone regulation and spleen size, and near BDKRB2, implicated in the physiological response to immersion. These are heritable biological changes accumulated through natural selection over a period consistent with thousands of years of maritime nomadism. The genome carries the signature of the way of life. The body itself has become an archaeological artifact of the toolkit, as legible as a maroon ceramic assemblage or a Cossack sitch's absence of palatial architecture. This is recent evolutionary change in a living human population, and it is direct physical evidence that the sea nomad toolkit was not a recent cultural adaptation, but a way of life old enough and stable enough to reshape human biology. The depth of that history is worth dwelling on. The peoples of maritime Southeast Asia are heirs to the Austronesian expansion, one of the great migrations in the human record, beginning perhaps 5,000 years ago when seafaring populations originating around Taiwan moved south through the Philippines and the Indonesian archipelago, and then astonishingly outward across the open Pacific and westward across the Indian Ocean as far as Madagascar. This was the most far-flung maritime dispersal of the pre-modern world, and it was accomplished with outrigger canoes, a sophisticated body of navigational knowledge based on stars and swells and the flight paths of birds, and boat-building traditions that the sea nomads carry in modified form to the present. The Bajau and the Moken did not invent the maritime toolkit. They are the wing of a very old Austronesian tradition that specialized in it most completely, that took the boat from a means of migration and made it a permanent home. The kabang, the Moken houseboat, is the material expression of that choice, a vessel designed not to arrive anywhere but to be lived on, carved from a single log and built up with bamboo and thatch, a house that floats and a boat you can sleep a family in. The Moken of the Andaman Sea offer a different order of evidence. In 2004, when the Indian Ocean tsunami struck, several Moken communities had no casualties. They read the sea's behavior in the hours before the wave arrived and the unusual recession of the water, the movement of fish and birds, and moved their boats to deep water before the wave reached the coast. Their oral tradition contains a story called the Laboon, describing a great wave sent by the sea spirit with practical instructions for what to do when the sea shows these signs. That knowledge, preserved in narrative across generations, reached the affected communities faster and more reliably than any government warning system. The institutional knowledge and the functional knowledge were the same thing. The political relationship between sea nomads and coastal states was historically one of managed mutual dependency. The Orang Laut occupied a carefully negotiated position within the successive maritime sultanates, Srivijaya, Malacca, Johor. They were essential, providing maritime intelligence, piloting ships through difficult straits, fishing the waters that fed coastal populations, serving as a fighting force when needed. And they were also ungovernable in any conventional sense. No fixed land, no permanent settlements, no property that could be taxed or seized. The sultanates maintained relationships with Orang Laut communities through gift exchange, nominal allegiance, and occasional intermarriage with community leaders. The standard tools of state administration did not apply to people who did not stay in one place. The contemporary situation of all these groups involves severe pressure from sedentarization policies across every nation state in whose territorial waters they operate. Fixed addresses, identity documents, school enrollment, formal health system participation all require stopping moving, and stopping moving unravels the toolkit. Several Moken communities have been resettled on land, the children no longer dive. The reef geography is no longer being transmitted. The kabang, the traditional boats, are rotting on beaches. The toolkit is not infinitely resilient. The Zomians, the archaeology of deliberate exit. Many of the hill peoples of mainland Southeast Asia, the hundreds of distinct ethnic and linguistic groups living in the highlands running from Tibet through Burma, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, and into Yunnan, are descended from lowland people who chose to leave, not driven out, not too isolated to know better. They went to the mountains because the mountains were outside the reach of the kingdoms forming in the valleys below, and they engineered their societies to stay there. James Scott's 2009 book, The Art of Not Being Governed, named and theorized this at full scale. Scott called the Highland Zone Zomia, borrowing a term coined by the historian Willem van Schendel from a Tibeto-Burman root meaning highland, and estimated that it encompassed roughly 100 million people across a dozen countries, speaking hundreds of languages, organized into thousands of distinct communities. What they share is not a common culture or origin, but a common political logic. Across centuries and in diverse ways, they organize themselves to stay outside state control. The Swidden agriculture, the oral culture, the ethnic fluidity, the messianic religious movements that periodically pulled populations further upslope whenever states expanded below. These are a toolkit for ungovernability. The linguistic evidence is the clearest signal. The language families spoken in the highlands of Southeast Asia, Tai-Kadai, Austroasiatic, Tibeto-Burman, all have their oldest and most complex forms in lowland contexts, in the river valleys and coastal plains where early states formed. The highland variants are daughter languages that diverged after populations moved upslope. The timing of these divergences, estimated from vocabulary change rates, consistently falls within the past 2 to 3,000 years, exactly the period during which lowland state formation was intensifying. The languages carry the history of the exit in their structure. Ancient DNA work from Thailand and Yunnan confirms the same picture. Upland populations share ancestry with lowland populations, but display the signatures of isolation and founder effects. The genetic pattern of a group that split from a larger population and moved into a new environment. These are not populations with a separate deep ancestry. They are the descendants of people who left. Edmund Leach's fieldwork with the Kachin of Highland Burma, published as Political Systems of Highland Burma in 1954, had already identified something that static ethnographic frameworks had missed. Kachin communities shifted between two fundamentally different forms of social organization, a hierarchical form called Gumsa and an egalitarian form called Gumlao, in response to political pressure from lowland states. When the Burmese or Shan kingdoms expanded, Kachin communities moved toward the Gumlao end, more egalitarian, more mobile, harder to administer. When pressure eased, more hierarchy was tolerable. The political form was adaptive, not fixed. The individual technologies of ungovernability are worth examining carefully. Swidden agriculture, slash and burn, as colonial administrators called it with persistent disapproval, is a rotation system in which a forest plot is cut and burned, cropped for 1 to 3 years, and left fallow for 10 to 30 years while the forest regenerates. The burn releases nutrients. The fallow rebuilds soil fertility. The system is highly productive per unit of labor, and it is calibrated for mobility. No permanent fields, no fixed infrastructure, no storable surplus large enough to justify the effort of taxation. It is a production system that, whether by design or by the selection pressure of centuries of living near predatory states, makes its practitioners difficult to administer. Oral culture works the same way. Writing produces records, records produce censuses, censuses enable taxation and conscription. A community that maintains its knowledge in oral form exists from the perspective of the state in informational darkness. Ethnic fluidity compounds the effect. The permeability of hill group identities in Southeast Asia makes social composition difficult to inventory and allows communities to dissolve, reform, and reconstitute under pressure faster than any administrative record can track. Even the choice of crop can be a political act. Scott makes a striking argument about what he calls escape crops, cultigens whose properties happen to frustrate the tax collector. Wet rice, the foundation of every lowland state in the region, is the ideal subject of appropriation. It ripens at a known time. It sits in visible fields. It stores in granaries, and an army can arrive at harvest and take it. Root crops behave in the opposite way. Cassava, sweet potato, yams, and taro, many of them New World arrivals that spread through the highlands after the Columbian Exchange, stay in the ground until they are needed, can be left for a year or more without spoiling, ripen unpredictably, and yield nothing a raiding party can carry off in bulk. A hillside planted in cassava is, among other things, a hillside that does not reward being taxed. The same logic extends to dispersal itself. Scattered fields, mixed plantings, and crops at different stages of maturity are agronomically sensible in poor soils and also, not coincidentally, illegible to anyone trying to assess and seize a surplus. Thongchai Winichakul's Siam Mapped demonstrated how the modern Thai state constructed its territorial boundaries in the 19th century through negotiation with European colonial powers, drawing lines on maps that transformed the ambiguous, overlapping, graduated sovereignties of the pre-colonial world into sharp, modern frontiers. The Zomians did not move. The lines moved around them. People who had been moving through a landscape without fixed political affiliation were suddenly on one side of a border or another, subject to the demands of a nation-state that had not previously existed. The camel nomads, desert as highway, domestication as revolution. The dromedary camel was domesticated from wild populations in the southeastern Arabian Peninsula sometime in the late second millennium BCE. Ancient DNA analysis, including a 2016 study in PNAS, identified the genetic signatures of domestication in ancient camel remains and established the geographic origin of the domestic population. Zooarchaeological bone measurement provides the corroborating evidence. The reduction in average size that is the universal signature of domestication, the effect of selective breeding beginning to take hold, appears in the Arabian camel bone record around 1200 to 1000 BCE. Before that, dromedaries were hunted. After that, they became the enabling technology of an entirely new political economy. What a dromedary can do: carry 250 to 300 kilograms across terrain that destroys horse hooves and breaks wheeled vehicle axles in temperatures that kill most other working animals for days without water. The physiological adaptations are well documented. The ability to tolerate large fluctuations in body temperature, the capacity to lose up to a quarter of body weight in water before physiological impairment, the ability to rehydrate rapidly, drinking up to 100 liters in minutes once water is available. These are not marginal advantages. They represent a qualitative difference in what is logistically possible in desert environments. Richard Bouliet observed in The Camel and the Wheel, published in 1975 and still the foundational work on this subject, that wheeled vehicles disappeared from North Africa and the Middle East following the widespread adoption of camel transport, not because people forgot about wheels, because in sand and broken terrain, a pack camel is simply a superior technology. The wheel requires a road or, at minimum, a flat and firm surface. A camel requires neither. The infrastructure investment required to make wheeled transport work across the Arabian Peninsula or the Sahara is enormous and permanent. A camel requires only knowledge of where the wells are. The technology ran backward, the wheel lost. The political consequence of camel domestication was the transformation of the deep desert from an impassable barrier into a protected corridor. Before the camel, the interior of the Arabian Peninsula and the Central Sahara could not be traversed at the scale required for sustained long distance trade. After the camel, they became the freest highways in the ancient world, free in the specific sense that no state could police them because no state could operate in them. The deep desert was simultaneously a protective moat and a commercial infrastructure. Your warehouse moved, your road was invisible. The Nabatean case is the clearest expression of what this made possible. The Nabateans, an Arab people who from roughly the 4th century BCE controlled the trade routes connecting the Arabian Peninsula to the Levant and the Mediterranean, built their capital at Petra, the rock-cut city in what is now southern Jordan, carved from rose-red sandstone in a narrow valley accessible only through the gorge called the Sek. Petra's archaeology is extensive and ongoing. The elaborate tombs cut into canyon walls, the colonnaded street, the temples, the theater, the sophisticated water management system of cisterns and channels, all of it funded by the movement of frankincense, myrrh, spices, and luxury goods along routes that the Nabateans controlled and that ran through terrain only they had the knowledge and animals to navigate. Frankincense itself is archaeobotanically traceable. Boswellia sacra, the tree whose resin produces frankincense, grows in the dry mountains of southern Arabia, the Dhofar region of Oman, and in the corresponding mountains of Somalia and Ethiopia. Frankincense resin has been recovered from archaeological contexts far from its source, from Bronze Age Egypt to the Roman Empire, and its geographic origin is identifiable through the specific isotopic composition of the resin. The long-distance movement of this product documents the reach and the durability of the camel-enabled trade network. The pre-Islamic Arab tribes of the Hijaz, who controlled the key nodes of this network, the Quraysh of Mecca in particular, the tribe into which Muhammad was born, were operating within the same political economy. Mecca was important not because of any particular natural resource, but because it sat at the intersection of routes from the south, east, and north, where the annual Hajj pilgrimage, which predates Islam, provided a recurring occasion for intertribal commerce and negotiation. The mobile, desert-literate, camel-based culture of Central Arabia was the medium through which Islam first spread. The networks that carried trade goods and the networks that carried ideas were the same networks. The Comanche, the speed of transformation, and the ecology of defeat. In 1680, the Pueblo peoples of what is now New Mexico rose against the Spanish colonial administration that had occupied their lands for 80 years. The Pueblo Revolt, led by Pope from Okai Owinge Pueblo, drove the Spanish South, roughly 2,000 survivors marching to El Paso del Norte, and the Pueblo peoples held New Mexico for 12 years, until the Spanish reconquest of 1692. In the chaos of the revolt and the subsequent retreat, thousands of horses escaped from Spanish corrals and scattered onto the southern plains. To the north and east of this chaos lived a people called the Numu, a Great Basin group, speakers of a Uto-Aztecan language, organized in small, flexible bands, moving on foot through the high desert, hunting deer and bighorn sheep, harvesting pine nuts and other plant foods. They appear in Spanish records only peripherally before the late 17th century. They were not, by any conventional measure, a major power. Within a generation, their equestrian descendants, known as Comanche, from a Ute word that roughly translates as people who fight me all the time, had moved onto the southern plains and begun the transformation that Pekka Hämäläinen documents with precision in his 2008 book, The Comanche Empire. By the early 18th century, the Comanche were raiding Spanish settlements in New Mexico. By the mid-18th century, they had effectively expelled the Apache from the southern plains. By the early 19th century, they controlled an area larger than France, were extracting tribute from Spanish and Mexican settlements, and were the dominant military and economic power of the southern plains. The speed of this transformation has no close parallel in North American history. The horse amplified what the Numu already were: mobile, flexible, expert at reading landscape, organized in small autonomous units that could aggregate rapidly and disperse just as quickly. The band structure was not a fixed group, but a fluid association of related families that could split, merge, and reconfigure in response to resource availability, political tension, and military opportunity. This flexibility, made faster and more powerful by the horse, was the key to Comanche military effectiveness. There was no capital to capture, no supply lines to cut, no center whose destruction would end the war. The captive integration system is the element of the Comanche toolkit that most consistently surprises people encountering it for the first time. The Comanche raided Spanish, Mexican, Anglo, and Native American communities and took people, particularly children and young women. Those people were absorbed. A child captured at age 8 and brought into a Comanche band was adopted into a family, given kinship relations, learned the language, participated in ceremonial life. Their children were Comanche without qualification. The historian James Brooks in Captives and Cousins documented how this system of capture, adoption, and kinship ran in every direction across the southwest borderlands. Spanish, Pueblo, Apache, and Comanche communities all took captives from one another and folded them into the social body, and how it knit those societies together even as it set them at war. The Comanche ran this system at scale. They were a self-replenishing population, drawing people in from across an enormous range and incorporating them into both the social and the biological fabric of the society. It was a deliberate strategy, and it was the encounter and recombination dynamic at high speed. Spanish speakers, metalworking knowledge, intimate familiarity with the settlements being raided, all absorbed into the expanding Comanche system. The strontium and ancient DNA methods that have lately begun to confirm captive movement in other borderland and diaspora contexts are only now being turned on the southern plains. The documentary and ethnographic record of Comanche absorption, however, is overwhelming and long predates them. The Comanche also ran a continental redistribution economy. They controlled the horse trade across the southern plains, acquiring horses through breeding, raiding, and trade, and redistributing them northward and eastward to groups as far away as the Great Lakes. They served as intermediaries between the Spanish and Mexican settled world and the plains groups to the north, trading captives, horses, and buffalo products for manufactured goods, and redistributing those goods through their own networks. At their peak, the Comanche were not raiders who happened to trade. They were a trading empire that happened to raid. They were not defeated militarily. They were defeated ecologically. Commercial Anglo hunters, equipped with long-range rifles and a market for buffalo hides in the eastern United States, systematically killed the southern buffalo herd across the early 1870s. Millions of animals within a few years. By 1878, the southern herd was functionally extinct. The buffalo were the food, the hides, the trade goods, the animals whose seasonal movements organized the Comanche calendar. Without them, there was no material basis for the toolkit and no reason for the mobility the toolkit required. The last free Comanche bands came into the reservation at Fort Sill in 1875. The toolkit did not fail. The world it depended on was deliberately and systematically destroyed. The Woku, embargo, trade, and the archaeology of a manufactured crime. The Haijin was the Ming dynasty's maritime prohibition, enacted in its strictest form in the early 15th century and maintained with varying degrees of enforcement for most of the following 2 centuries. It banned private seaborne trade entirely. Chinese subjects could not go to sea for commercial purposes. Foreign merchants could come to designated ports under the regulated tribute trade system, but private maritime commerce, Chinese merchants trading on their own account with foreign counterparts, was illegal. To understand why this made the Woku inevitable, you have to understand what the Haijin was prohibiting. The coastal communities of Fujian, Zhejiang, and Guangdong had conducted maritime trade with Japan. The Ryukyus, the Philippines, Java, and Malacca for generations before the Ming. This was not a marginal activity. It was the primary economic base of entire communities, the capital, the family networks, the occupational identity that organized coastal life across the South China Sea. The hygiene did not end this practice, it criminalized it overnight. The Ming moral universe that produced the hygiene is worth understanding on its own terms, because without it, the logic seems merely stupid rather than coherent. In the Ming imperial framework, the emperor was the center of the world. Everything of value flowed toward the center, tribute came in, imperial benevolence went out. The great treasure fleets of Zheng He in the early 15th century were not commercial expeditions. They were demonstrations of imperial gravity. Private maritime commerce, a merchant from Fujian trading with Japan for his own profit, on his own account without authorization, was presumptuous in a deep cosmological sense. You were acting like the center when you were not the center. The Haijin was the logical conclusion of that framework. If private maritime trade is an affront to the imperial order, close the sea. The revisionist historiography of the Woku, the term means something like dwarf bandits, a slur referencing Japan that was applied to people who were predominantly Chinese, is associated with historians Tanaka Takeo and Kwanwai So, and, more recently, with scholars like Depon David Ho. Their argument, now broadly accepted among specialists, is that the 16th century raids on the Ming coast were conducted predominantly by Chinese people doing what they had always done, now outside the law. The distinction changes everything. If the Wokou were pirates, people who had adopted raiding as a way of life, then the Ming military response was a law enforcement problem. If they were embargoed merchants using violence as a negotiating tactic, then the Ming military response was a policy failure that was making the situation exponentially worse with every expedition. Wang Ji is the central figure, a merchant from Huizhou who relocated his trading operations to Japan after the Haijin criminalized them. Wang Ji built a transoceanic trading organization, managing routes between Japan, China, and Southeast Asia, licensing operators, mediating between Chinese coastal communities and foreign traders. Simultaneously, he was writing letters to Ming officials requesting amnesty and the restoration of legal trade. He wanted the ban lifted. The violence was instrumental. Without the credible threat of disruption, his letters were worthless. The Ming executed him in 1559, luring him into negotiations under a promise of amnesty and reneging. The Haijin was partially lifted in 1567. The raiding substantially ceased. The people the Ming had been calling pirates became merchants again, which is what they had been throughout. The archaeology cannot distinguish between a Wokou trading base and a Wokou raiding base. They were the same places on different days. The boats, the goods, and the routes were identical. The legal category was the variable. The material record shows continuous commerce, sometimes armed. In the physical evidence, there is no piracy. There is only the South China Sea maritime economy, operating with or without official permission, depending on the year and the enforcer. The water margin frame is genuinely useful here and not merely literary. Shinai An's 14th century novel about the outlaws of Liangshan Marsh is a story about a world in which the state's categories have failed. Good men turned outlaw by corrupt magistrates, men who did nothing wrong but found themselves on the wrong side of a charge, men who are genuinely dangerous operating in the same networks as the former two, because the marsh takes everyone the mainland rejected for whatever reason. Among the operators in the Wokou networks were people who were simply violent for money, with no political program, who raided because raiding was profitable, and the Haijin had made it possible to do so with impunity. Wang Ji needed the reputation such people created, because without credible violence his negotiating position was empty. The networks held them all. They were not the majority and they were not the cause, but they were there, which is the honest account. The Roma, a diaspora toolkit across 1,000 years. Somewhere around the year 1000 CE, a group of people left India. There is no chronicle of the departure, no founding narrative, no Aeneid. What remains is evidence left behind without intention. in the language, in the genes, in the practices that survived 1,000 years of diaspora across the full width of Eurasia. The Romani language is unmistakably Indo-Aryan. It belongs to the same branch of the Indo-European family as Hindi and Punjabi. The core vocabulary, the words for body parts, family relations, basic actions, and numbers, is derived from an early Indo-Aryan source most closely related to the languages of northwestern India and the Punjab. Overlaid on this Indian core are strata of loanwords: Persian, Armenian, Byzantine Greek, and then the languages of wherever specific communities settled in Europe: Romanian, Spanish, English, Finnish, Turkish. The loanwords are a log of the migration. They accumulate in the sequence of the journey, and you can read the route in the vocabulary. Population genetic studies of Romani communities across Europe consistently identify a founder effect, the genetic signature of a small founding population distinct from surrounding European populations, and place the ancestral origin in northwestern South Asia, in the region of modern Pakistan and northwestern India. The timing of the founding bottleneck is consistent with a migration beginning around 1,000 years ago. Ancient DNA and linguistics agree on the origin and the timing. The communities in the Indian textual record most consistent with Proto-Romani characteristics are mobile occupational specialists: metalworkers, musicians, horse traders, entertainers, healers, people whose livelihoods were portable and whose social position was marginal within the caste hierarchy. Mobile craft specialists occupied a recognized but socially ambiguous position in many traditional societies, useful, even essential, but not fully integrated into the settled community. Why they left India is still genuinely uncertain. The leading hypotheses: caste intensification in the 11th and 12th centuries, military disruption from the Ghaznavid and Ghurid invasions of northwestern India, straightforward economic opportunity in the Byzantine world, are not mutually exclusive and probably all contributed for different families at different moments. The departure appears to have happened in multiple waves over an extended period, not as a single organized migration. The Roma arrived in Byzantine-controlled territory in the 12th and 13th centuries, speaking an Indian language and already practicing the mobile craft specializations that would define their European history. Over 2 or 3 centuries, they spread across the entire width of Europe, from Constantinople to Andalusia, from the Balkans to Scotland. The Irish travelers, the Pavi, are genetically and culturally distinct of Irish origin, but developed a parallel toolkit of mobile occupational specialization. Their language, Shelta, combines Irish Gaelic grammatical structure with a vocabulary designed to be opaque to outsiders. Language as privacy technology. The Roma toolkit in Europe rested on the same logic as every other case in this essay: skills that are portable, requiring low capital, resistant to guild control or state licensing, and useful in every economy. Metalworking can be practiced wherever there is metal and fire. Music can be performed wherever there are people who want it. And Romani musical traditions have been among the most consequential in European history, foundational to flamenco in Iberia and to the musical traditions of Hungary and Romania. Horse trading requires mobility and the ability to evaluate animals, not a fixed location. The Romani herbal and medical knowledge, documented by ethnobotanists across European communities, traceable to South Asian, Persian, Byzantine, and European herbal traditions, maintained orally in Romani across a continent, is one more expression of the same generative synthesis. The critical difference between the Roma case and every other case in this essay is territory. The Cossacks had the steppe, the Maroons had the mountains, the sea nomads had the water, the Zomians had the highlands, the camel nomads had the desert, the Comanche had Comancheria, the Roma had nowhere that was theirs in any durable sense because they were everywhere. Their protective margin was perpetual movement, the capacity to be somewhere else when the current situation became untenable. This made the toolkit more adaptable and more vulnerable simultaneously. Every landscape they moved through had margins where their skills were useful, but there was no defensible territory, no place of last resort, no mountain valley or open steppe to which they could retreat. In the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, the territories of modern Romania, Roma were not merely marginalized but enslaved in law and in practice for roughly 5 centuries. From the late Middle Ages until emancipation in the 1850s, Romani people there were the chattel property of boyars, monasteries, and the state, bought and sold, their families divided, their labor owned outright. This was one of the longest running systems of slavery in European history, and it sat at the heart of the continent rather than at its colonial periphery. It is a corrective to any romantic reading of the diaspora toolkit. Mobility could be curtailed, and where a state was determined enough, the people who lived by movement could be fixed in place and owned. Emancipation, when it finally came, released a population into societies that had spent centuries treating them as property and did not stop despising them when the law changed. The porajmos, the Romani word for the Holocaust, meaning the devouring, killed between 500,000 and 1.5 million Romani people, a proportional death rate comparable to or exceeding that of any other group targeted by the Nazi genocide. The statelessness that had been the survival technology of 1,000 years became, in the context of the 20th century's industrialized ethnic violence, a catastrophic vulnerability. There was no Roma state to protest, no army, no territory, no diplomatic representation, nothing but the movement, and the movement was stopped at the borders. Coda, what the archaeology keeps finding. 9 cases, 9,000 years, 5 continents. The pattern that accumulates across all of them is not a unified theory of freedom. It is a recognition that the archaeological record, read without the categories that states have imposed on it, reveals a long series of sophisticated, durable, and genuinely alternative ways of organizing human life. People under pressure encountered a new possibility, an animal, a landscape, a neighboring people's knowledge, and borrowed from it selectively. The recombination produced something new, a working society with its own subsistence system, its own spatial logic, its own governance, its own bodies of knowledge. Not freedom as an abstraction, but freedom as a set of specific tools, specific relationships assembled under pressure from whatever was at hand. None of these societies were simple, and none were composed entirely of people pursuing good ends. The raids were real. The violence fell on real people who were not the state, who were just neighbors with cattle or grain or boats. And the mirroring dynamic, borrowing the methods of the people trying to destroy you and turning them back, ran through most of these cases. The Cossacks were the most dramatic example. Freedom toolkit becoming imperial instrument within 2 centuries, but it runs in subtler forms through the Maroon military command structures, the Woku protection rackets, the Comanche tribute economy. The freedom toolkit does not sort people morally. It creates conditions in which the desperate, the principled, the entrepreneurial, and the genuinely violent all end up in the same operational network because that is where the protection is. The archaeology keeps producing evidence that something real was built. Bone measurements and seed assemblages and isotope ratios and ancient DNA and the branching points in language trees are not just technical data. They are the material traces of real societies that assembled real things from whatever was available under conditions that did not permit delay. The colonial archives called them bandits, savages, pirates, primitives. The material record does not corroborate this. It says something real was built here. Something was carried across generations, across continents, across the catastrophes that ended so many of these societies. Some of it is still being carried. The story we have been told about how human beings organize themselves, the story in which the settled state is the natural endpoint of human social evolution and everything else is failure or incompletion, is a story told by states about themselves for their own purposes. The archaeology of the last several decades has been quietly and consistently producing a different and more complicated account. These cases are 9 threads in that account. The full tapestry, when we have enough of the threads in hand to see it, will be larger and stranger than the story we inherited. There is a painting in St. Petersburg that is almost 3 meters wide, 24 men laughing, composing a letter. The laughter is the sound of people who built something real and knew it. It is still audible.